Now, there isn't just an original copy that we can go back to and see what the original said and interpret it for our times. The way that the stories were passed on originally was through oral tradition. And then as the society became a literate society and people could write and read, the masses couldn't read. It didn't serve their purposes to learn how to read. The monks were those who read and who wrote. So they would be in a room, and a scribe, they would be scribes. Somebody would be reading out the story, and they would sit there and write down what they heard. That's how copies of these books were made. Now again, the Bible wasn't the Bible at that point. They were individual books. So for instance, if they wanted copies of the scroll of Isaiah, let's say, then someone would be in the head of the room reading out a line, and the others would be writing it down. You can see that that's a recipe for mistakes, and mistakes were often made. And sometimes it wasn't an oral reading and them writing. Sometimes someone would sit down with the scroll and then copy another one. Now, if you have ever done that, you know that you make mistakes. Sometimes you invert letters or words, or you'll skip a line or something. So whenever they realized their mistakes, they couldn't just throw it away because these were holy writings in a sense. So they buried them. Now, if you follow that line of thought for a little bit, as archaeologists go and do digs in sites and they find these sacred texts, what kind of texts are they finding? Are they finding the good copies of texts, or are they finding texts with errors in them? These are all questions that archaeologists and biblical scholars have before them. So you will notice when you read a Bible, often at the bottom of a page, there will be footnotes. And the reason these footnotes are there is to help us understand, or try to understand, what the most acceptable reading of that text may be. So for instance, if we have 5 different copies of the scroll of Isaiah and there are some differences among those will be noted in the footnotes. Generally, the older a scroll is, the more authority it's given, because it's not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. The closer you can get to the original or the oldest is considered most authoritative. You may have heard the news about in the last century about the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a huge discovery. And archaeologists and biblical scholars had to determine, where they fit in that timeline compared to other writings. So there isn't a perfect original writing or gathering of the words. And that's important to note. So when we gather these writings together and put them into what we call a Bible, there are a lot of questions. And this first happened, a long time ago. The legend goes that there were 70 scholars, and Greek was the language of the day because Alexander the Great had conquered the world. And they wanted to get all of these holy texts together. So these are Greek-speaking folks. And the legend is that there were 70 of them, and they spent 70 days, and they wrote all this up, copied all of the ancient Hebrew texts, and they came together and had this, what they called the Septuagint, because Sept is an abbreviation for 70. It has that root in it. And that was seen as an early authoritative text. So our modern translations often go back to that Septuagint scriptures, collection of scriptures. Now, some go back to a newer version later on in the chronology, but a newer version after the Romans had taken over and Christianity had spread and Latin was the language of the day, and put together this translation of the Septuagint into a Latin version called the Vulgate. Vulgate is from the same root as the word vulgar, and it simply means common or of the people. Now, we have taken vulgar in our common understanding to mean something a little different than that, but vulgar in its original sense in Latin literally means common of the people. It would be vulgar to the higher classes or to the aristocracy. Common. So those are necessary to understand when we open up a Bible, to know what we are looking at. And in the Old Testament, we are looking at translations that either come from the Greek Septuagint or from the Latin Vulgate. The King James Version of the Bible comes from the Latin Vulgate. Other translations, like the New International Version, which is a really popular common version translation that we have today, and the English translation goes back to the Greek Septuagint, as does the New Revised Standard Version. And for academic purposes, those are seen as a little more authoritative because they go back to an earlier accounting. So, first of all, please realize that we don't have a perfect copy of the original stories as they were in the prophecies and the Psalms, the writings, all of those things. The translation we have in front of us in English is a translation of translations of translations. And when we decide what kind of Bible we want to use, it's important to understand we are using a translation of a translation of translations. First of all, the Bible wasn't gathered together in English. It was originally, if it was contained in the Old Testament, in the Protestant tradition, it had to have origins in the Hebrew language. In other words, the earliest copies of the scroll had to be written in Hebrew in order to be considered authoritative enough to be found in Scripture. Now, in Catholic Bibles and in some Orthodox Bibles and others in other parts of the world, there is called the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha is a part of the Scripture that chronologically comes between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And though if Old Testament is authoritative, the Apocrypha is just right here because the earliest records of that are in Greek instead of Hebrew. So just a slight little difference there kept it from being included in the Protestant Bible. And the Orthodox or Catholic Bibles do contain those, even though they were originally, the earliest copies are in Greek. Now, I know that's a lot of background and you might not care about all of that, but I want you to know that all of that was involved in the coming together of the Bible. And did you know that the Bible didn't come together in the form as we know it until the 15th century? The Council of Trent in 14 something got together, and the reason they decided that these books would be the official Bible or the canon, the canonical books, is because there were some challenges and some teachings that were pushing the boundaries a bit. So the council got together and decided, nope, this collection of readings, these 66 books, or in that case at that time, these 66 books plus the Apocrypha would constitute the Bible or the canon.